Welcome to Biology of Marine Mammals. I'm Dr. Leslie Williams, and this lecture covers pinniped foraging. We'll start by looking at some of the trends in pinniped foraging strategies, followed by what types of dietary items they tend to consume, and finally we'll look at a special category of pinnipeds that tend to prey on what's called warm-blooded prey. So let's go ahead and start with some of the trends that we see in the trophic roles of the pinnipeds. First and foremost, they are carnivores, as noted that they belong to order Carnivora. But even though they are carnivores and therefore eat animal products, they are also predators by and large. And some of the other options for being a carnivore but not a predator would be like a scavenger. A vulture is a scavenger. They come around and try to find dead things. So they're going to actively hunt and pursue living prey, consume, and then capture them and consume them. They also tend to feed almost exclusively in the water. Although there are reported instances of pinnipeds hunting on land, it's very, very rare. So by and large, they eat things that are already in the water. When they use their teeth, they tend to use it for the capture of the animals, but not necessarily for mechanical digestion or chewing. So that's in contrast to the sirenians, which use their flattened molars to chew seagrass extensively. And then also, there's an exception to this. There is one animal that doesn't use their teeth really much at all for their feeding, and that's the walrus. The walrus, which tends to have very long tusks, those tusks tend to be more for dominance and other uses, and instead they employ suction feeding to try to get out mollusks or something like clams or oysters out of the mud. And finally, the species tend to be more concentrated in areas that have subtemperate, subpolar, and polar waters because that tends to be where there's more food. So in other words, there's a reason why you don't see a lot of pinnipeds in tropical waters. Although they do live there, there's not very many. Most of them tend to be in the colder waters where there's more abundant food supply. So just what type of dietary items do pinnipeds eat? I find it convenient to break it down into four major groups. The first is marine fish and squid. So any type of small or medium or even large fish, and then squid is going to be one group. The second group is going to be zooplankton, and this is usually in the form of krill. A third dietary category is going to be mollusks and crustaceans. These are going to be invertebrates that include things like crabs and lobsters for the crustaceans, and then for the mollusks that would include squid, clams, and oysters. And finally, we have an interesting category called warm-blooded prey. These are going to be animals that include other pinnipeds and also birds such as penguins. While we are going to take a look a little bit at how different pinnipeds eat, one of the things that's more interesting is that even within a species, the diet is surprisingly variable. In other words, unlike a lot of the other marine mammals where you say this marine mammal species eats pretty much just this food, even within a species of pinnipeds, you see a lot of what's called diet plasticity. Diet plasticity means that they eat different things. They have a big variance in diet. So we say that variance is intraspecific. The word intra means within, and specific means species. So within a species, we have a lot of dietary differences. So for example, if you take a look at a crab-eater seal, despite the name, actually feeds mostly not on crabs, but on krill. And so that's kind of one example. But then you have the other example where you have leopard seals. Certain individuals within a leopard seal population will also consume krill. Other individuals will consume crab-eater seals, so that's quite a big range for one species of leopard seals. That's an example of that intraspecific variation. So some other examples that we see of that intraspecific variance within a species are going to be that juveniles of most species tend to feed on different foods than adults. As a rule, the food that they tend to eat tends to be of lower caloric value but easier to capture. And this, of course, is because these smaller, less experienced pinnipeds don't have the skills, the maturity, or the ability to dive as deeply as the adults do to capture larger, maybe more evasive prey. So they go for the easier to capture stuff, but it tends to be not of high quality. Also, a really interesting example was noted in Washington State, where you get a lot of steelhead that actually spawn yearly. They noted that several California sea lions had learned to aggregate near the mouths of these freshwater rivers as the steelhead were coming in to spawn. And so they would just pick off these spawning steelhead at these mouths of the rivers. What they did note is that year over year, it was the same sea lions. So while you wouldn't necessarily say that spawning steelhead was a staple of the California sea lion diet, surely there were certain individuals that had learned to specialize on a food source. And interestingly enough, it's quite a big mortality bite in there. They're responsible for a mortality rate of up to 50% of those steelhead that enter the rivers. In other words, only 50% of the steelhead that made it to the mouth actually made it past the mouth of the river, simply because instead they made it into the mouth of a California sea lion. So quite a big impact for just a few individuals of pinniped. So with that out of the way, let's actually turn to the really interesting idea of warm-blooded prey. So which pinnipeds are going to prey on what's called warm-blooded prey, which includes other mammals, almost always other pinnipeds, and birds such as penguins? Well, there's really three categories. We have leopard seals, which we'll talk about in a little bit. We have the larger species of the otariids, so these are going to be some of the fur seals, possibly stellar sea lions. Most of this is going to be in the southern hemisphere. And then interestingly, we also have the walrus, which, as I mentioned earlier, a staple of the walrus diet is going to be mollusks. So that's quite a big change for the walrus. I want to start by talking about the walrus. The walrus does have two big tusks, and male walruses have been known to actually use those tusks to stab other pinnipeds, usually pups or females of smaller species, and then consume the flesh. But it's also been noted that polar bear flesh has been found in walrus guts, which suggests that they eat polar bears. From a previous lecture, you might recall that polar bears sometimes eat walruses. So you actually have walruses that will engage in a fight with the polar bear and sometimes win by stabbing them with their tusks and then eating the flesh. Some of the otariids will also eat smaller pups and penguins of different species. And it's interesting to note that it is almost always the adult or subadult males that engage in this behavior. Rarely is it females. So now we'll turn to the leopard seals, which in my opinion are some of the most interesting predators in the pinniped family. So leopard seals are notorious for eating pinnipeds and penguins. And I want to talk about their penguin predation here for just a moment. Penguins tend to be terrified of leopard seals, and for good reason. In the picture here on the left, you see a whole flock of penguins that all look like they want to jump into the water to feed, but they're terrified too. And that's probably accurate because, as a rule, what they do is they aggregate up on these ice floes or even these little pockets of land, and they kind of play a game of chicken. You first, no, you first, no, you first. And sometimes one penguin will even push another penguin into the water, because the first penguins to dive in are going to be the ones that are most at risk for being captured and consumed by a lurking leopard seal. The picture on the right shows you why the penguins are so terrified. In this picture here, as I've circled, you can see this is a leopard seal that's actually captured a penguin and is in the middle of shaking its skin free of its body. So what they'll do is they'll actually grab a penguin and they'll chew some part of it off. Often it's the feet, though not always, and then they'll shake it vigorously or throw it up into the air. What that process is doing is actually degloving the penguin. So it's removing the skin and feathers from the underlying muscle. A terrible way to be consumed for sure. So leopard seals, because they are so good at capturing and eating penguins, of course. Penguins have learned to try to avoid them. And so here's some other pictures of that predation event. You can see in the upper left-hand corner, a leopard seal just actually comes up and shakes the ice floe, and you can see one of the penguins there up here is about ready to slip into the water. That one's going to be the new meal for this leopard seal. In these other pictures here, you can see part of that penguin's being basically degloved from the rest of its body. This is the meaty part. This is the skin carcass here. And again, here's another picture of that thrashing event. So because leopard seals do prey in this way, other penguins will actually watch and see what happens to their peers and realize they don't want that to happen to them. So they do a lot of evasive techniques to try to get away from these leopard seals. And finally, leopard seals don't just consume penguins, they will also consume other pinnipeds. Their favorite is going to be crab-eater seals, which tend to be mostly on the smaller side. So here in the foreground of this picture, we see a leopard seal. In the background, there's a crab-eater seal. They are coexisting on this ice floe with what seems to be kind of a peaceful understanding, and probably there's two possible reasons for that. First is that the crab-eater seal may be too big for the leopard seal. Secondly, this may be a leopard seal that just doesn't eat on or feed on crab-eater seals. In fact, when you look at the leopard seals, they don't all eat crab-eater seals. It tends to be more specific geographic locations. So you might have a particular area where the leopard seals feed more exclusively on krill, and a particular area where the leopard seals have specialized to feeding on crab-eater seals and penguins. And so that concludes our lecture on warm-blooded prey and pinniped foraging, and I will see you next time.